Hello, everyone. So we've got our next panel coming up. So join me in welcoming Lauren Barrett back to moderate the discussion for navigating product from startup to enterprise.
Thank you. So we have a great panel for navigating product from startup to enterprise today. We have Ron Fisher, former director of strategic product growth at MindBody. Rashmi Keitha heads up product at Verizon, and we have Jignesh Hingar, who is a senior product manager at Spotify. So I'll welcome them up and also let them introduce themselves a little bit more as well.
Okay.
So defining the product in a 20-person organization and running a product portfolio at a Fortune 50, both take really strong product leadership, but very different strategies to navigate, and you're in very different situations as well. So I'm really excited about this panel. I think a lot of us have worked across both startups, scale-ups, and enterprises, and we have a lot of good topics on the docket. But Ron, I'll let you start introducing yourself a little bit more before we dive in.
Sure. Hello, everyone can hear me? Hi. My name is Ron Fisher. I was formerly the CEO of a startup called Bowtie, which I co-founded with my team, who's also here, actually, over there in the back. It was an AI receptionist for small businesses that we scaled and sold to companies in the US, the UK, Australia, Canada, and then we eventually sold that company to a company called MindBody. If anybody has ever booked a yoga class in any metropolitan area, you might have encountered the brand. And then we left MindBody to start a new company called Mesh at withmesh.com, which is a way to send overlaid communication and guides to customers that makes it seem like you're on a Zoom call with them when you're not there. Thank you.
Great. Thanks. Rashmi.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Again, my name is Rashmi, currently a product manager at Verizon, where our team kind of focuses or acts like a startup within a big corporate company. So we kind of roll around ideas really quickly, trying to generate net new software businesses on top of the 5G network, around 2 to 3 revenue generating businesses every year. And my role before that, I was not in product. I was actually in data science, and then started off college thinking I would be a doctor. So I started off in pre-med and then completely switched into CS after that. So I love my journey. I love where I am today and learning for product. Thank you.
Cool. And Jignesh.
Hi everyone. I'm Jignesh Hingar. I'm a senior product manager at Spotify. I'm part of their process change in financial systems. So we're trying to figure out how do we get Spotify to scale for their next 20-30% growth. I've been in product management for about a decade now. Went through the journey of startup to mid-sized companies to now Spotify, which is a huge company. So, yeah.
Great. So all at different sized companies. Let's kick off by talking a little bit about the kinds of customers that you have on the different sized companies and how that might differ and how you're starting to sell your products.
I can start. So, so this company that I'm in now is obviously very early stage. We're in month 3 of it, but I could speak to my experience at Bowtie and MindBody. Definitely at the beginning of our journey as a startup, we were targeting smaller businesses, owner-operator types, people who can make decisions on the fly, and I think that's really important when you are building a startup, to go for people who can make those quick decisions, who aren't requiring pen tests and security audits and things of that nature. And then over time, you obviously can go for those bigger and bigger fish. And part of what happened to us in that process is as we went up the food chain, we really had to wrestle with companies that were trying to tell us how to shape our product. And that's something that's really challenging. So as you kind of grow up, as a company, you end up encountering people who have very strong opinions, who have multiple stakeholders, who think they know about your product better than you know about it. So just as a quick story about that, we had a company called Elements Massage, which was, I think, 400 location brand that came to our website through somehow they had found out about us. We were so excited that they actually came in. They booked a demo inbound. We're like, oh my God, this is going to be so easy, right? That never actually ends up being the case. It ended up being something like a year of back and forth. We ended up building a lot of features of our bot in order to account for the way that they wanted to operate. So what they actually thought is that we have an AI receptionist for booking. And so they thought that the customer would want to actually go through a series of like 15 questions to book their exact masseuse that they want. Like, what pressure points do you want? Or how hard of a massage do you want? And then they also wanted the businesses at each location to like tag every single customer. Suffice it to say, it's as complicated as I'm explaining it to you now for everybody involved. And then that enterprise company ended up churning out. And it actually took another 3 years to bring them back. And if we had said no to begin with and stuck to our guns, I think that story would have gone in a very different outcome.
I think in general, when you talk about a startup, you're probably looking at customers who are more B2C sort of customers, where they're actually looking to use your product more and more. So more of external-facing customers. For a startup, that's more the focus, because you're more willing to take risk. You're more willing to try new things. You're more willing to fail fast. Versus an enterprise product could depend on whether it's an internal customer or external customer, and that kind of changes the game, because if it's an internal customer, you probably have to deal with a lot of multitudes of stakeholders, leadership, politics, also the amount of risk that the organization is willing to take. Not all organizations are risk averse or risk willing. Larger organizations tend to be risk averse, so I think that kind of digs into how well you could go about your product growth.
I agree, and I like that you mentioned like that difference between B2C and B2B, because the team that I'm working with right now, they're mostly building B2B products. So there are different channels of users coming in. One is definitely the people that you're trying to sell to, the users, core users of the group, and then there will be like another whole new user base who will not use the product, but they will have a say in everything that you want to talk to. They'll come into every interview, be like, oh, this is how the business processes work. But I'm like, you're not the one using the actual product, though. And then the third group that we work with is the actual like other startups and as an incubator. So we want like their point of view too, because as a startup, you're like both of you mentioned, you're more closer to like failing fast, failing early. You were able to pivot, be more flexible. So you will also want to study how startups are doing, what trends are they following, and then can we as an enterprise kind of follow their trends, make that build versus buy decisions quicker, and kind of join forces to build revenue.
And do you find, just to riff on this a little bit, that it is easier to build B2C or B2B in startups?
I mean, from a startup perspective, I think B2C, from a product development standpoint, I think B2C would probably make more sense to me, just because you kind of get to explore a multitude of things when it comes to talking to a customer, doing design, talking about, all right, what do you want to see in your journey as a customer? Versus a B2B customer, they tend to drive it from the perspective of what their organization wants, and that kind of could tamper with what you see as your product growth or product kind of vision in general. So that's how I kind of think B2C at the start of your career or the start of your product kind of makes more sense.
It's funny, I think the exact opposite. From my perspective, like consumers are vicious and they're cheap and they're cruel, right? Like something is broken in the app, they're going to give you a 5-star review immediately and see what the hell is wrong with you.
That's true.
Yeah.
I mean, look at the reviews on Ticketmaster. I just looked recently. You'd think that it was like a spam app that's like trying to steal all your money.
Yeah.
But I think from my perspective, if you're going to start a startup, and it's easier to do business because they have bigger budgets, they have bigger problems, and you have the potential to build something. I mean, they both can end up being really big, obviously.
Yes.
Spotify as well, but I don't know, something about it is, it seems a lot more challenging.
Yep.
But I think that's where like the key in building the right team comes into. Like you always want someone on your team who is ready to, like that extrovert that we call, like just go out and talk to the first person that they see who is probably their user. because when you're interviewing or finding that product like market fit type of thing, interviewing B2B customers is very different from interviewing B2C.
Yeah.
Where B2C, you're able to create those relationships up front, like, oh, like, how's your day going? Like, kind of be very casual and then go into the pain points and then create like a user story, where B2B is more of a formal like meeting. Be like, okay, you business, me business, let's talk operations.
Cool. I want to transition a little bit and talk about the skill sets needed. What are some of the skill sets needed as a product leader, and how might they differ across the startup, scale-up, and enterprise spaces?
I can go. Yeah, I mean, for a startup, I mean, I worked at the startup at the start of my career, and I was doing business analysis, technical analysis, business development, marketing, product development, product testing, QA, anything and everything you can find around a product. I mean, it was a good experience, but then you kind of figure out in the first couple of years of your career as to where do you think your strengths fit, and kind of how do you think you can mold your career into. From a product standpoint, it's an excellent perspective you get, because you're talking to your customers, you're talking to your engineers, you're actually driving the decision making there, so you have much more control. Even though it's unstructured, at least you have an ability to think fast, make it happen, and actually drive the value for the company. When you go to a mid-size or a larger company, then you're talking about navigating a breadth of, I mean, you could categorize them as stakeholders or business or process owners or controls folks or compliance folks, and then you have the leadership. So you're probably talking about you're focusing more on getting alignment, so then communication kind of becomes your most important skill set, and relationship building. I think those are the two key ones that really could help you as a PM build a base around, okay, this guy knows what he's doing, probably needs more knowledge around the process, or this guy knows everything, let's try and see if he can deliver within the first 3 to 6 months. So I think that's where the focus kind of changes.
And I would just maybe add on like delegation as like a third one, just going from having like worked in both creating a startup from like a 3-person team to actually going to enterprise and working with maybe 3 other teams of people in your own squad. It's, you kind of go from that mindset of like, I want to do everything, or I have to do everything at that point, wear many hats, and then completely go 180 and be like, okay, I know what needs to be done, but there's someone here who I can think of as my partner, and how to get them on the same page with me, and then kind of delegate and share responsibilities. So that shift is very important.
Yeah. I would also add that the feedback loop, obviously, in startups is much faster.
Yeah.
And you're also doing all the research yourself, which is something that I would recommend to anybody who's trying to start a company, right? You're like trying things out with these customers. And the dangers there is obviously that sometimes they say that they want something, but then you give it to them and they don't actually use it. So you always have to take what they're saying with a grain of salt.
Yeah.
And one good way to do that is to actually make them commit to you up front, whether that's like giving you even like $10, signing a document, like that shows a much more serious attitude towards your product than they would just if they're saying that they want to use it. And then, yeah, once you're at an enterprise, all of the different functions that you had previously are kind of like outsourced. So once we were at MindBody, we had a research team that we had to rely on to talk to customers a lot of time. We had to kind of work with a lot of different teams to push things forward. So having the ability to like influence other teams and get other engineers and other departments to actually cooperate is a skill that you definitely need in an enterprise and is pretty much irrelevant at a startup.
I would just add in here, like at large enterprises, I feel the delegation I found to be more important, and then at startups, getting more cutthroat around prioritizing, well, what balls are you just going to drop because there's only so many people to do so many things. So let's talk about discovery and how we do that at startups versus large enterprises. And Ron, you started to touch on this like a little bit with the research aspects. What are some of the pros and cons that you found that makes it like easier, more effective to do discovery in startups versus the enterprise? What are some of the nuances there that you've navigated?
I can go. I think That's a very subjective topic in the sense that if you're at a startup or a mid-sized company, the odds are that you're probably doing discovery thinking about what is your goal for the company, whether it's revenue generation or customer acquisition. So you're like focused around your discovery around, okay, what feature sets do I have to build, and then talk about prioritization through there. In a larger organization, you generally hear conversations around what are our OKRs, what do we want to achieve, whether it's risk reduction, cost reduction, revenue generation, or just stability, right? So then depending on that, kind of the discovery element gets divided into sort of who's the process owner, what do they want to do, what do they know, and it's more driven by them. And then you kind of think about, okay, how do I fit their process into the product that I'm trying to build and create a map around that. So I think that kind of nuance comes into picture when you talk about discovery between a startup or an enterprise.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And I think what just came to me is when you're in a startup, you shouldn't be tied to like what your product necessarily is at the beginning. And I think back to when we were building Bowtie and we were very much dealing with like getting revenue for the business. And then as we were developing the product, we were hearing from them that they also really wanted reviews and they wanted to improve their reputation. And that wasn't necessarily something that we had originally anticipated to do with the product, but through the discovery process and the research, we said, wait, we can get into that space too. And actually, when we were getting acquired by MindBody, we later went into their Slack history and saw that that was a big reason that they were starting to pay attention to us, because we were starting to win deals because of the fact that we added that component. And so you shouldn't be ever afraid to define yourself too concretely in terms of one space or another. If you want to take over a bigger chunk of what that business is doing, in fact, that's actually probably more appealing. And then, yeah, as you were saying with the enterprise, it ends up being very top-down. And we were lucky because we were coming in through an acquisition, so we had a lot of autonomy to operate. But definitely, as I was seeing other PMs, like they're often forced to just take on the project that's handed to them. And I think you really have to prove yourself in an enterprise to break away from that type of cycle.
Yeah. I think you touched on the right point there. Trust becomes the most important ingredient here for all your business process owners or your leadership to actually say, okay, let this person go the route they want to go and see where they land with us.
Exactly.
And it's also maybe like pivoting at the right point. Like the way, I can give an example from my team. We follow like the 4-step process. It's kind of looking at idea discovery, or like what is the whole, can you boil the ocean type of thing, and then put some guardrails on that. And then go down to, okay, now you have an idea. What is the opportunity? So that's like the market landscape, market fit, interviewing who's actually your customers. And then after that would be hypothesis generation. And this is where I've seen a lot of teams internally, even at Verizon, they start with one hypothesis and they're not willing to let it go. After some time, you're like, no, we need proof to either prove it right or prove it wrong, but we need more and more proof. And I think at what we call, 70% confidence. If you're 70% confident that this goes one way or another, leave it, move on to another hypothesis. And I feel like that really helps to keep the flow going.
Yeah.
Do you feel like the idea generation cycles or the discovery has to go quicker at startups or slower in enterprise? This is like a bit of a leading question, but like if so or if not, like how can you influence that?
I think for a startup, it's important to have a multitude of ideas, right? I mean, you're trying to grow your business, you're trying to establish a footprint in the market, you're trying to identify your right customer segmentation. The startup that I worked at, we tried everything. We tried HTML5 gaming, we tried an ad exchange like Google AdSense, we tried energy management, we tried a multitude of things, and we found niches in multiple markets. Like US was a major market for us from an HTML5 gaming perspective. Europe was a huge market for energy management. Ad exchanges, I think that's something that got picked up around 2014. So I think it depends on how well your company is able to adapt to the market. So for a startup, I think ideas, having multitude of them and then just being customer obsessed really can get you through the door.
I agree. I think for startups, you want to kind of get your brand like upfront, like this is who we are, like not to rigidly define it, but at least like get your name out there. So you have to work really quickly to at least get your first product or first iteration out, and then you can keep improving and do tweaks and everything. But for an enterprise, I think it takes a little slower because enterprises usually have that like platform mentality. Be like, okay, if we want one product, will this fit into the bigger ecosystem? And then they're always kind of level setting between that like big cloud and then kind of building different products underneath that.
Great. We have questions coming in, so I'm going to start sprinkling in some of the ones that are coming from the audience. The first one is, what do you think are some of the biggest lessons that startups can learn from large companies, and also vice versa?
I could take that one, actually. So one of the things that I think we did benefit from for now the next startup is around like long-term planning. So like, yes, on the one sense, I'm saying you should be open and be able to change and have feedback, but I do think like having rigor around like what you want to do for the year, like what do you actually think is realistic. By the end, our team basically had put up to eventually the board like half of the things that the rest of the teams had put up. And we were saying that our department was scared because they were saying that maybe that's going to make us look bad. But actually, in the end, the board was very receptive of that and very happy to see that because they knew that it was everything that it could actually be done. And I think being realistic about what can come out when is something that you kind of lose sight of at the startup. And for a long time when we were building our company, we were just kind of like, running with our heads cut off. And then eventually we started processes and plans and more rigorous roadmaps that I think we could have benefited from definitely a lot earlier.
I think, definitely agree with that. I think I was thinking about my experience at a startup and what I'm doing at Spotify, and one of the things that strikes me is I think you could take the ability to fail fast into a larger organization and kind of set expectations that it's okay if you fail as long as you're learning things out of it and you're failing fast. So like a startup could take a month or 2 months to fail. In larger organizations, you could talk about 2 weeks, 3 weeks to validate an idea and move on. So I think that's very important to take with you as you go to a larger organization and kind of set that culture that kind of keeps you honest to your product development and product growth in general.
I've also found an interesting dichotomy at enterprises where sometimes, or at least in my experience, there's the appetite to fail is pretty low, but the capacity to fail is actually quite high, which is like the opposite at startups. So navigating that's always lots of fun. Cool. How can you, I guess this is like a little bit of what we started with, but how can you develop a startup to have the processes of a larger organization after experiencing rapid growth? And I guess if you all wanted to riff on it, more specific examples, feel free to go for it.
I'm trying to think. So.
I mean, for me, what comes up, it's not really a product-specific answer, but it really is around like your actual systems for tracking everything. So like making sure that you have the right process to track your churn, to track your cohort analysis, to track your billing. Like all of these things are going to come back to haunt you really fast if you don't have that going. So we had like so many different sets of records that by the end we had like a master Excel sheet where we were trying to like piece things together, beautiful mind style. So definitely if you have that correctly set up from the beginning, then as you scale and become a larger organization, that's going to really pay off. And that's also going to pay off when an acquirer potentially comes in because they really want to know your numbers. They want to know like, what's your CAC? Like, what's your LTV? Like, how long has each customer lasted on average? And then they're going to really ask you those questions, like, what happened in January of last year? And you're like, I have no idea. I actually need to go figure this out.
Go ahead.
And like in the topic of tracking, it's not just maybe like going off of that is tracking what different work streams you have, because now you have customers who have asked you like, oh, I want to see this change or I want to see that change, but now you have like a larger enterprise also asking for different changes to be done. So how do you prioritize that? Like what are your metrics to like this is the most important feature to work on next? And this touches upon like most of the talks that we had yesterday. But like prioritizing of different work streams, I think is a good process to kind of take up as you grow.
That's actually the hardest thing. I mean, the loudest voice in the room sometimes
Yes.
pays you the least amount of money.
Yeah.
They say like somebody pays you $100 a month and somebody pays you $10,000 a month will scream just as loud.
Yeah.
So being really diligent about that and seeing, we would have arguments all the time. It's like, okay, but is this affecting one customer or is this affecting 50% of our customers? And managing that noise is something extremely valuable.
Yeah. I think just last point to add over there is, as you've grown and you've experienced rapid growth, the thing to keep in mind is customer feedback. It's very important to incorporate your customer feedback into your daily processes, whether it could be how you think about what changes you want to do in your product, or how you think about your subscription services, or how you think about marketing your product. I think keeping that in mind and keeping yourself close to the customer will keep you true to what's needed in the market.
Great. There's a question up here too that moves us a little bit more into the people space. So I'm going to take that one. I don't know if I see it anymore. Oh, yeah, it's at the bottom. How do you manage timelines in terms of market changes and also manage burnout in startups specifically?
That could be a long conversation.
I feel like that gave us all of us like PTSD like all at once.
It's like a heavy question, yeah.
Well, for us, philosophically, like you could hire to grow or you could grow to hire, which is to say, like the way we kind of thought about it, it was like we should be at the point where we are cracking, which our CTO, Mike over here, actually was before we hired an engineer under him. Sorry about that, Mike. But I think it was really important because with a startup, right, you all have an owner mentality. You're trying to drive the business as far as you can. And I think if you don't get to the point where you're overworked before you start bringing new people in, then you're going to set up your company to fail. And I think that's just part of the game of being in a startup. And enterprise, I'll let you guys speak to that.
Yeah, I think segregation of duties kind of becomes very important at one point. And I think personally, I've always tried, like at the start of the career, for the first 3 years, I was just working and working and working. And at some point I realized that burnout factor was coming into the picture. And what I tried to do was have conversations with your team, right? Set expectations around, okay, what are the roles that you expect out of people to actually do, and when do you want them to step in, and where you are with your mindset around how you're thinking about the company and the growth. It's very important that you really separate yourself in terms of not thinking about work the whole day, and think about, okay, what are other people in the industry doing? Like, how is product being developed across the globe? What technologies are coming into the industry? So I think from that perspective, that'll give you a larger sort of data set to work with, and then you either, as Ron said, you hire and more people, or you think about build versus buy conversations where you're not always worrying about building everything in-house.
Yeah.
Do you think burnout looks different at a startup versus an enterprise?
Yes,
Yeah,
definitely yes. I mean, at a startup, you're possibly thinking about 15, 20 different things at the same time when it comes to, okay, the CEO thinks this is the direction that we have to go, the engineering manager thinks somewhere else we have to go, the architect doesn't really agree with the technology that we're going for. You're talking about specific customer feedbacks. You're talking about, okay, how much time do I need to build this? You're talking about money and cash flow problems in general because you're working with tighter budgets. In an enterprise, I think the burnout is more related to, I mean, at least from my experience, the burnout is more related to process and politics related, more so than the product related. So, yeah.
Interesting.
I was going to expand on that. Is one of the speakers yesterday, she mentioned like for enterprise especially, if you walk into a room, just you have to repeat yourself for like the 100th time. And that's a burnout in itself. It's like I've said this every meeting, but it's okay. Like this is our mission, vision, goal, and trying to align everyone in the room. So just to add on to that, like it's hard if like the engineering team itself, and if you hire someone new in that team, they will come in with their own thoughts. So you're like, okay, like this product has been growing for a year, but I see this new direction. You hire someone else, they'll come in with like, oh, I see this going in a completely different direction. So I feel like burnout is different in enterprises due like just bringing people to the same page. It's not like traditional burnout of just working and creating decks. It's like relationship building and talking to people that also exhausts me, especially.
Yeah, I think enterprise burnout is definitely around, yeah, that whole process notion. And I also think that when you have engineers working on your product, it's also really important to like have them feel heard. So like you have really strong opinions about the product, like you know exactly where it's going to go, but like they're also starting to formulate ideas and like they also want to contribute, and giving them some slack and like some autonomy to move forward and try things, even if you don't necessarily agree with it. You know, there's the sense of like, if something is like 80% good and they bring it to you, like, do you correct it or not? They say like, don't correct it, like let them run with it, because then it actually feels like it's theirs. So I think that that's really, really important. And I think with startups, you also like, with enterprise, you were saying like it's about time off, but like with startups, it's like you even when you're off, like you can't take time off. Like your brain is just like going and going. Like you're in bed and you're like thinking about it and thinking about it. And I mean that's part of the fun, but that's also part of the emotional exhaustion. And there's not really a cure for it. It's just something that again you have to suck up in the process.
Cool. Let's talk a little bit more about people. Specifically, what are the different types of PMs needed, from a startup to an enterprise, and what are some things that you all do in hiring and retaining like talent on your own teams for these different sized organizations?
I was just gonna say, like, I had one of my mentors kind of explain this to me a year ago, where she said, kind of think of it like that XY axis, and then you have on one axis, it's very strategic, like overall very big picture focused type of PM, and then on the other side it would be very like goal oriented, like this is our next step, step by step. And then on the horizontal axis you have like one who's technical, like a pure technical product manager on one side, and then on the other side it would be a very customer and like emotional focused person. So I've had that like image ever since she's told me, and you'll see all four extremes, and you'll also see people really managing their role as a PM in the different quadrants as well, mixing those four qualities. So I think as you grow in the career, you'll also find your own comfort spot, and then you'll be able to apply for those types of product manager roles. But then when you're hiring, you'll also be able to reflect upon like, what does the team need today? Do we need more people like who will be talking to stakeholders? Then you might probably hire for that, maybe like customer focused, highly strategic product manager. So that, I think that quadrant helped me just focus for myself, and then also help other people like find their journey.
Yeah, I have to say I was very lucky. One of my co-founders is the chief product officer, and he can design and speak to customers and be technical and do all the things. So I think that was like a unicorn.
He is the quadrant.
Yeah, he is the quadrant. But I feel like for me, if I were to like pick one to focus on, I think the customer obsessed and like being able to talk to people and prioritize stands out as something that is a trait I would look for first if I had to pick between the attributes there.
Yeah. I think in general, depending on the industry, the kind of skill set changes. If you're in a financial services industry versus the tech industry, the expectations are very different. But in general, keeping in touch with the data part of a product manager kind of puts you right at the spot where you could target different industries, but at the same time, you could look at expanding your scope towards the more technical side, as Rashmi mentioned, or the more generic PM side where you're more process focused. So I think it all depends on you as a person or as your personality. Is it more strong on the communication side? Is it more strong in being in the background? Because that's what's going to drive your growth in any organization that you go.
Well, I've also heard the analogy, and someone on my team introduced it to me, of bricks and balloons. So you need like a little bit of both. You want the balloons, like the big ideas, and then like the bricks to lay the foundation. And I think like in a startup, having a little bit more of the balloons, like you definitely need both, but some of the balloons, like big ideas, like vision, selling, this is where we're going, is really valuable, especially at the beginning, to like get people on board with the vision and where you're going.
Yep.
Great. We'll take more questions from the audience. The first one, how would you take a large non-tech services company and pivot to creating a tech-focused startup environment? So I think this question is also asking about a transformation maybe from like services almost to SaaS a little bit as well, and what that might look like.
I mean, without knowing specifically what the services or the tech is, I would say there's so many ways to start tech products now with zero tech knowledge. There's like products like Webflow and all these app builders that you actually need no code. So I would recommend just starting with those types of tools, faking it as much as you can, and then proving out the value and the concept, and literally doing the entire thing manually at the beginning. We had a company that was acquired by MindBody before us, which is a company called Frederick, and literally everything they were doing was manually. They were like scraping all the emails from the calendar system of these businesses. They were sending it to India. India was then doing a ton of manual emailing at different times. Like every single part of that business was entirely fake. They grew it into a multi-million-dollar operation, eventually productized every single part of it. So you really don't necessarily need engineers for a lot of ideas. I don't know which one you're specifically thinking of, but probably you could just start in that route.
Yeah.
Cool. Great. Another question is, how do you balance driving short-term results to keep stakeholders happy and then making long-term investments that you're unsure of will pay off? And Ron, I actually think this was going back to a story that you kind of told at the beginning with one of the large companies. But yeah, how do you manage those trade-offs?
I think when you talk about a longer-term investment, right, you're probably thinking 1 year, 2 years horizon, because that's where your company is kind of thinking, okay, where do we land 5 years from now? The important piece over here is to understand what core problem are you solving, right? If you generally, a business comes and says, I know what the problem is, and when you start asking questions about that problem itself, you kind of 9 times out of 10, I've noticed that you kind of dig into their real problem, which the people on the ground are actually performing the actions on. So I think it's important to drive that conversation before you decide whether you really want to go short-term or a long-term method. And yes, there are instances where you'll definitely be doing short-term investments and you'll collect a ton of tech debt. But I think overall, as long as that short-term investment that you're doing kind of helps you pivot or helps you grow on your longer-term roadmap, that would definitely be a worth investment.
And I'm a person who's like a glasses half full person. So even if you do end up making that long-term investment that you're unsure of that it will pay off, I feel like in the short term you can kind of convince your stakeholders that if something isn't going in that direction, you can find ways to pivot really quickly in the short term and make sure that maybe it won't pay off like 100% or 80%, but can you get it to 50% and at least show that potential? And then once you have that buy-in, and then kind of build on top of that. So I always think there's a way to like think creatively to pivot in any way and to kind of create those opportunities. But that's me, just optimist talking.
There's a will, there's a way.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say at enterprises, this is actually easier in a sense because of the fact that it's not like life and death hanging in the balance every single day. But I would say at a startup, it's just really important to remember the why of the long-term investment, because it's not something that's going to have immediate payoff. And getting everybody on board, especially during like sprint prioritizations, the person who's championing that project needs to remind everyone that we all agreed that this is the important thing that we need to be doing, because you'll very quickly forget. So if you're that person who has that in mind, like you can't be afraid to like keep bringing it up and keep saying like this is what we all agreed to, like we have to stick to it, even if these 10 customers have asked for this other feature that they're claiming is the burning fire that they need put out.
I think to add just the last point just came to my mind as you were talking about it. I think POCs, proof of concepts, are the most important piece here. Whether you're doing short term, whether you're doing long term, to validate both the theories, you really need to do POCs and see if that kind of addresses the problem that you really started with.
Cool. Great. What's your take on bureaucracy at large enterprises that might prevent you from moving fast? I'm sure this is relatable to everyone on stage and everyone in the audience.
So I do have a strong opinion about this one. Again, like with a startup, you hear something from one or two customers and you know it's the right thing and you're like, okay, let's do this. And I think what we learned at MindBody is that like immediately, it's not that anybody has a strong opinion against you either way. Like actually nobody wants to have a strong opinion because nobody wants to look bad at the end. But what I would say is people just want to see numbers. People want to see a well thought out process. Whether you like it or not, they need to see a full deck and a full revenue estimate and lots of proof points. And it's not that any of those things is necessarily hard to get. It just can be very frustrating. But people want to say yes to you, right? They want you to take that risk because it's on you at the end of the day. So as long as you're willing to build the case and put that case together in a clear document, then usually you're going to actually get done what you want to get done.
Yeah, I think larger enterprises, it's good if you accept that bureaucracy is part of the business rather than trying to fight it, because that way you can think about, as you're thinking about your product life cycle, you probably can bake in time around splitting your discovery from your design to your build and probably testing in general, right? Versus at a startup, you're probably doing multitude of like discovery design at the same time and then testing and probably deployment very close to each other. So I think it's better if you kind of accept it, and I think relationship building is the key in any large organization when it comes to bureaucracy. If you have those relationships set out and you have that confidence and trust, the odds are you might move a little bit faster, but moving fast like a startup in a large enterprise rarely happens.
There's always that, there are two aspects to it, like things that you can control and things that you cannot control. So I would ask questions about things that you cannot control up front. Like, for example, if I'm working, I know like the products that I should be focusing on, my customers should be B2B. Okay, that's one guardrail. The other guardrail is what types of industries is Verizon itself looking at, and so we are looking at warehouses like oil and gas. We're not looking at retail. We're not looking at healthcare. So I know that I have a good focus on which industries to look at. So things that I cannot control, I just want to get that quick answers from. And then while you're working on your like opportunities and your opportunity areas, things that you can control from, like obviously data speaks volumes. But what I've started doing recently is take quotes from like customer interviews and be like, I'm going to quote that customer and put it on the slide. Just be like, he's making my point for me. He said it, here's the quote, and then here's the data beneath that. So I think that like building that slide itself helps.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. Like having a combination of like individual data points from people who have quotes, and then also just like a larger study, so saying like, that this will reduce churn by 2%, or this is going to increase the sales, and talking to the different sales manager and saying, hey, if we add this feature, how many more units can your team sell? And literally going to every single sales leader and asking, and them saying, we can do an extra 10, 15, 20 sales a month, and then putting that all together, I mean, that's going to be a home run.
Yeah, and I think also, unless you've like nailed the problem, like if you haven't sold them on like the shared problem, whether it's like what's projected or like what's happening today, then they'll like glaze over anything else. And then I also love the quotes aspect. I found that that's been a silver bullet in a lot of situations. Because no one's going to come in and say, no, I don't really think that the customers or like the users like think
exactly.
that.
And I'm like, I put quotes around this. They said it directly to me. Yeah.
Great. Like couple of other questions here, and we have like more coming in. I can't see them all on the slide. So for someone transitioning into product management from an adjacent role, would a startup or enterprise environment be the better career launch pad? That's a really good question.
I can probably take that one. Yeah. So yeah, like as I said in my intro, I went from healthcare to pure computer science to more analytics, to like dashboarding, and then to finally into product management. And my leeway was a startup. And that was me core, like putting like my feet inside like the whole process and doing all the roles in itself. I didn't know it was called product management back then. I just thought, okay, like I'm talking to customers. I think of product as like the 3-circle Venn diagram where you have like customers in one, and then you have like technology or your engineering team in 2, and then like strategy, vision, and business in the 3. So product sits really nicely in between these. So when I was working at my startup, I was just 3 people, and then we played those 3 roles. And then I got to see like how product kind of comes to life, how to even interview customers. So long story short, I would start with a small project. You don't have to like kill yourself and actually try to build a startup. That's not a good transition, but it'll teach you everything. You could try doing it enterprise way. It's just my personal way was to kind of get that feet on the ground and start working. So my suggestion would be to pick a project and try to see if you can build a product out of it. And you'll learn a lot just from that small project.
Great. I had another question, and it had come up a couple times in the last few minutes, and you touched on it, Jignesh, around like relationships and networking. And we talked about bureaucracy. How important is like building your network and building your relationships, and how does it differ, between a startup of maybe 20 people, a scale up with which you like already have product market fit and are figuring out different things, and then 40,000 person company?
Yeah, I think with a startup, the thing is, the odds are you're working with the entire team very closely week over week, and most likely you're going on Fridays getting a beer because some customer came and said, what the hell are you building? So you're probably working very closely with the entire team, and you're actually trying on multiple things. During the day, you're having multiple conversations, and those conversations are not like you're sitting in a meeting room and having formal meetings, versus an enterprise where at least my day, more than half of my day goes in meetings.
Yeah.
And you don't necessarily interact with everybody who you really want to. So I think that relationship aspect, you probably have to put more effort in an enterprise and kind of, go for a coffee, have one-on-ones, or just, book time on their calendars to say, hey, just wanted to say hi. It's important you do that because as you're going through your day or your month, you kind of lose touch of that individual connection sort of a piece in an enterprise, and it's very important that you put effort to actually do that. Go for a lunch, get a coffee. In the virtual world, probably just gossip in a lunch meeting.
I've actually seen this like real life because where I'm in an enterprise and kind of in a startup mentality team, we did not have to go in person to work over COVID. But my friend he's in startup and their CEO mandated coming in person every day for that reason. And you can see like even if you're sitting next to each other, like typing on the laptop, like no one will be talking to each other, but like, I don't know, is it telepathy? Like you'll just like convey ideas, you'll come up, and then it's just easier to get everyone into a meeting room and build on thoughts. So I've actually seen that work out, and when I share my experiences with him.
Yeah, I mean, you just touched on remote, and I think that obviously is here to stay. And
Yeah.
with product world, like especially in an enterprise, like we wanted our product once we were MindBody to mesh with the other products, and so we did have to do a lot of outreach. We did have to meet with people a lot one-on-one. But actually, the most effective thing that ended up happening for us towards the tail end was we had a company conference, which some of us went to, and that's how we met a lot of the PMs that were working on the core product. And then that resulted in us actually starting to collaborate with them. And then from there, we ended up fleshing out the entire plan to bring our product into like the core platform. So that would have probably never happened had we not built that relationship. And luckily, we're able to build it in person. So I would say if your company is having in-person events again, then definitely do your best to get in there. It's not guaranteed that you're necessarily going to be selected, but make it a priority because that's where things happen. Like if you build that rapport, then that person is going to slack you back and not just like ignore you for 48 hours, which tends to happen in enterprise environments.
Yeah.
Cool. I think we just have time for like 1 or 2 more questions. How do you grow as a product manager when your company is, rapidly growing from a startup to a scale up?
I think the most important thing that I've seen personally myself doing is thinking large and taking on more sort of a strategic mindset. I think when you're working as a startup PM, you're more tactical. You have goals. You're probably trying to just get delivered on those goals. Versus as you're growing as a company, you probably not need to start thinking about, all right, what branches do I need to expand my product into? What are the markets I can target? Or what sort of customer segmentation can I dive into further compared to what I have? So your mindset needs to kind of start thinking about 6 months to 1 year down the line rather than 3 to 6 months. So that becomes very important. And it's very important that as a product group, let's say if you're the only PM, then that you can't do much. But if you have a group of PMs, I would highly recommend trying something out which is called as a product roast. Like we as PMs did it in one of the companies where we would come up with our own strategies on Fridays and we would present to our peers and they would essentially roast you.
Yeah.
Like poke as many holes as
that.
possible, and that way you kind of learn the different sort of mindsets that exist in the company and how you as a PM can really broaden your mindset as well.
That's so funny. One of my sister teams, they keep someone in the meeting rooms explicitly for that reason. Like he will be the devil's advocate and question everything that anyone presents up on stage. So yeah, that just reminded me of that. But I have probably maybe like 2 takeaways. One thing relates to that first question too is career launchpad. Definitely find mentors. There will be mentors at any stage of PM that you're in, no matter like 5 years experience, 1 year, 10 years. There will be someone else that you can learn from. And then number 2, which I blanked out on. It'll come back. You can go.
I mean, I agree with everything that was just said.
Oh, I found it. Okay. One thing that I learned while interviewing customers is most of the times the customers won't know what they want. They'll think that they want A, and then through like research and everything, you'll be like, oh, you actually want B. And then they'll be like, oh yeah, like that's what I actually wanted. Or they'll think of something and then you have to go find that opportunity. So like I think it goes back to your point of like take whatever the customer says with like a grain of salt, because there's probably something else that they really wanted. And I think that big picture thinking and that opportunity creation is something that I'm learning myself as I'm growing.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And actually, when you just said that, it made me think of when you're giving something to customers, you always want to make sure you give them 2 options. Because if you're just going to say, do you want X? They're like, yeah. But now we say, do you want X or would you want the original Y to be better? And then, half the time, like, no, actually, can you just keep working on Y? Like, don't worry about X.
That's true.
So.
Cool. I'll take one more question from the audience, and then we'll wrap up with a question that I always ask on panels. So, but first, how have you made a decision on where to go next in terms of the next product that you want to work on?
I think for me, I'm a very heavy LinkedIn user, so I try to reach out to PMs across different industries and just try to talk to them about what their company is doing, what products they're working on, kind of gather information and kind of understand, does that sort of a field appeal to me? Does that company appeal to me? What the culture is like? Like when I was thinking about Spotify, I reached out to a few PMs there, and one of the things that I understood is that Spotify really supports the think fast mindset, and it's more of a collaborative mindset. So that kind of appealed to my style of product management, and it happened. But I think it depends on how you approach, and again, network as much as possible, learn about the industry, and kind of talk to people in the industry. You would not believe how much receptive people are when you reach out to them and kind of they want to share their experience and they want to share what they've learned over their careers.
Well, for me, it's slightly different, but for people who are looking to do a startup, the first time we did the startup, we really focused on our own problems at the beginning, and that ended up leading us to a product that wasn't necessarily going to grow into such a big business, so we ended up pivoting to focus on the business owners we were working with, so like these small and medium-sized businesses. We scaled that business, but obviously then there were all the challenges with the product of selling to SMBs. And so then once we sold the company and started a new company, we took all the lessons of the first product and said, okay, like now we don't want to focus on SMB. How do we create a product that actually scales and that a company can pay, tens of thousands of dollars, $1 million. So like having that in the back of your mind as you're developing your next product is going to lead you down a totally different path. And touching on that LinkedIn thing, we got a lot of people to respond to us from a whole host of companies that you may never have imagined, like top tier AAA companies asking them for help, advice, research. And people are really helpful. They're really receptive. They're willing to jump on the phone with you and talk to you and share their wisdom. So don't be afraid to reach out to them and ask those questions, because sometimes you learn more in one conversation with that company in 30 minutes than you would have learned in 6 months searching the internet.
Yeah.
All right. What's your one tip, trick, or like takeaway for the audience here on navigating product from startup to enterprise? And mine is incorporate more roasting.
I like that.
Mine is don't be afraid to make them pay earlier. I was a huge wuss when it came to payments. I would like write these huge emails like begging them basically. When in reality I just needed to say like, we're cutting you off if you don't pay us next week.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, conviction in what you're trying to solve really is important, because that will validate the approach that you're taking over time, and actually combining that with your communication and navigational skills will really help you grow as a PM.
I think to close out, mine would be if you're not able to say no, which a lot of us struggle with, I would flip the question and just ask why. If someone has a suggestion, just ask them why. And then most of the time you'll hear them be like, oh, that maybe I'll work on my idea and then come back to you.
Yeah.
That happens 50% of the time.
Cool. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.